Think for a moment. What if everything you have lived until now, every challenge, every disappointment, every sudden awakening, was not random? Imagine that your life itself has been a long initiation, a silent sequence of trials designed to test something invisible within you. What if the fact that you are here listening to these words means that you have already passed a decisive inner test, one that most people never even realize exists? Today, we are going to explore a secret insight inspired by Carl Jung that has the power to change the way you understand yourself, your past, and the path unfolding before you. And I promise you this, the final revelation we will reach later is the most important and transformative of all. This is not a video about motivation in the superficial sense. This is an invitation to see beyond appearances, to look directly into the mechanisms that quietly shape your behavior, your fears, and your destiny. Jung believed that human beings are not merely reacting to the world, but are constantly guided by inner forces, symbols, and archetypes that operate beneath conscious awareness. When these forces remain unseen, they rule us. When they are recognized, they become tools for profound transformation. If you have ever felt that life has been pushing you, testing you, or stripping away illusions, this message is for you. Before we go deeper, take a moment to support this journey. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share this video with someone who senses that life is more than routines and survival, and write your reflections in the comments as we go. What you're about to hear may change how you understand your struggles, your purpose, and even your sense of identity. Jung spoke of individuation as the central task of human life. Individuation is not about becoming special or superior. It is about becoming whole. Most people live fragmented lives, identified only with a mask they present to the world, what Jung called the persona. This mask is useful, but it is not who you truly are. Beneath it lies the shadow, the parts of yourself you have rejected, suppressed, or denied because they did not fit the image you were taught to maintain. The shadow is not evil by nature. It contains fear, yes, but also creativity, power, authenticity, and truth. The first test almost everyone fails is the test of comfort. Society trains us to seek safety, approval, and predictability. We are rewarded for obedience and punished for questioning. Jung observed that people would rather cling to familiar suffering than risk the uncertainty of inner change. If you have ever felt an unexplainable dissatisfaction, even when everything seemed fine on the surface, that was not weakness. That was the psyche signaling that growth was being postponed. Passing the first test means sensing that comfort without meaning slowly drains the soul. The second test is confrontation with the shadow. Life has a way of forcing this encounter. It may come through betrayal, failure, loss, or a sudden collapse of identity. At these moments, you are faced with emotions you would rather avoid: anger, envy, grief, guilt, and fear. Most people project these emotions outward, blaming the world, other people, or fate itself. Jung warned that whatever we refuse to face within ourselves will appear to us as external enemies. Passing this test requires brutal honesty. It requires asking not only why this happened to me, but what part of me is being revealed through this experience. Reflect on this quietly. When life hurt you the most, did it also expose something true about you? A boundary you never set, a fear you never acknowledged, a strength you underestimated. These moments are not punishments. They are initiations. Jung believed that the psyche uses suffering as a language when consciousness refuses to listen. The third test is isolation. Not physical loneliness alone, but psychological separation. When you begin to see beyond collective illusions, you may feel increasingly out of sync with the world around you. Old conversations feel empty. Old ambitions lose their flavor. This phase can feel confusing and even frightening. Jung experienced this himself during his confrontation with the unconscious, a period when he felt deeply misunderstood and internally fragmented. Yet he later recognized it as a necessary descent, a symbolic death before rebirth. If you are experiencing this, understand something crucial. Withdrawal is not regression when it is guided by reflection. It is during these quieter, darker phases that the psyche reorganizes itself. This is where meaning begins to replace imitation. This is where you stop living borrowed lives and begin listening to your own inner authority. Throughout history, thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, William James, and later psychologists influenced by Jung recognized that transformation is never comfortable. Nietzsche spoke of becoming who you are, not discovering a ready-made identity, but forging it through tension and self-overcoming. Jung added depth to this idea by showing that what we overcome is not the world, but our own unconscious patterns. Here is an important question to sit with as we continue. What parts of yourself have you been running from, and what would happen if you stopped running? What if the very traits you judge most harshly in yourself hold the key to your next evolution? As we move forward, we will uncover why some people break under these tests, while others emerge with clarity, calm, and a quiet sense of inner authority. There is a final realization, a psychological threshold, that marks the difference between a life unconsciously lived and a life consciously chosen. And understanding it may change not only how you see yourself, but how you see reality itself. This journey is far from over. There is much more to uncover, and what comes next goes even deeper into Jung's hidden insights about the human psyche and the final test that redefines everything. As consciousness deepens, something subtle but powerful begins to shift. You start noticing patterns where before there were only reactions. Jung believed that the psyche speaks in symbols long before it speaks in clear thoughts. Repeating relationships, recurring obstacles, persistent emotions that resurface no matter how much you suppress them, these are not coincidences. They are messages. The second phase of passing the test is learning to read these messages instead of fighting them. Most people spend their lives trying to silence inner conflict. They distract themselves, numb themselves, or rationalize their pain away. Jung warned that repression does not eliminate inner tension. It simply pushes it deeper, where it gains autonomy. The unconscious, when ignored, does not disappear. It begins to act. It influences choices, sabotages progress, and creates crises that force awareness. This is why people often say they feel as if life keeps repeating the same lesson. In Jungian terms, the psyche is demanding integration. Integration does not mean eliminating fear, anger, or doubt. It means allowing them into consciousness without letting them rule behavior blindly. Think about how often fear has shaped your decisions without you realizing it. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of being seen, fear of being alone. Jung described fear as one of the primary gatekeepers of transformation. Passing this phase requires courage, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet courage to sit with discomfort without escaping it. Here is where many people believe they are failing, when in truth they are closer than ever. When old motivations stop working and new ones have not yet formed, the ego feels lost. Jung called this state the nigredo, a psychological darkness where old structures dissolve. It feels like confusion, emptiness, or meaninglessness, but psychologically, it is a clearing. It is the breakdown of false certainty. If you are here, you are not broken, you are in transition. Ask yourself honestly, who were you trying to be before and for whom? How much of your identity was built on approval, expectation, or fear? Jung emphasized that the persona, the social mask, is necessary, but when it becomes the whole identity, the soul suffocates. Life will then apply pressure until the mask cracks. This pressure can come through loss, burnout, illness, or sudden disillusionment. None of this is accidental. As awareness grows, another realization emerges. You begin to see that many conflicts are internal projections. Jung famously said that people do not see the world as it is, but as they are. This means that unresolved inner material colors perception. When you judge others harshly, it often reveals disowned aspects of yourself. When you idealize someone excessively, you may be projecting unlived potential onto them. Passing this test requires humility. It requires withdrawing projections and reclaiming psychological responsibility. This is not about blaming yourself for everything. It is about reclaiming power. When you understand that your inner world shapes your experience of reality, you gain the ability to change your relationship with life itself. Viktor Frankl, influenced indirectly by depth psychology, observed that while we cannot always control circumstances, we can choose our attitude toward them. Jung went further by showing that our attitude is shaped by what we are conscious of. Another crucial moment in this journey is encountering inner authority. Most people live according to external scripts. Family expectations, cultural norms, collective fears, and borrowed beliefs dictate their choices. Jung called this identification with the collective consciousness. Individuation begins when the individual dares to listen inwardly, even when the inner voice contradicts the crowd. This does not make one antisocial. It makes one authentic. Have you noticed moments when you knew something deeply, without logical proof, yet ignored it because it was inconvenient or unpopular? That intuitive knowing is not mystical fantasy. Jung referred to it as the guiding function of the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche. When you ignore it repeatedly, life grows louder. When you listen, even trembling, alignment begins to form. At this stage, many people feel an increased sense of responsibility. Not moral superiority, but inner accountability. You realize that blaming the world no longer satisfies you. You want coherence between inner truth and outer life. This is where meaning starts to replace mere success. Jung believed that modern humans suffer not because life is hard, but because it feels meaningless. Meaning is not found. It is constructed through conscious relationship with the psyche. Here is a question to reflect on now. If no one were watching, judging, or rewarding you, how would you live differently? What truth would you stop postponing? What inner call would you finally take seriously? What comes next is the most misunderstood and decisive phase of all. It is where many retreat, even after coming this far, yet it is also where the deepest liberation occurs. In the next part, we will explore the final psychological threshold that separates those who merely understand these ideas from those who are fundamentally transformed by them. As this journey deepens, a profound shift begins to take place. You start to realize that insight alone is not enough. Understanding the psyche intellectually does not transform a life unless it is lived. Jung warned that many people become collectors of concepts, mistaking knowledge for wisdom. The real test emerges when awareness demands action, when inner truth asks to be embodied rather than admired from a distance. This is where the third great inner challenge reveals itself: responsibility for one's own becoming. Up to this point, it is still possible to blame circumstances, upbringing, relationships, or fate. But at a certain level of consciousness, these explanations lose their power, not because they were never real, but because they no longer define you. Jung believed that maturity begins when a person accepts that, while the past shapes them, it does not have the final word. The psyche seeks not excuses, but integration. At this stage, many experience an inner tension between who they have been and who they sense they must become. This tension can feel exhausting. Old habits resist dissolution. Relationships based on outdated versions of yourself begin to strain or fall away. You may feel guilt for changing or fear of disappointing others. Jung observed that guilt often appears when we begin to outgrow unconscious agreements. Passing this test requires discernment. Not every voice demanding your loyalty deserves obedience. Here, the concept of the self becomes central. In Jungian psychology, the self is not the ego. It is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and transpersonal. It represents wholeness. When the ego aligns with the self, life gains an uncanny sense of direction. Not ease, but coherence. You may not know exactly where you are going, but you know when you are moving truthfully. One of the clearest signs of this alignment is the emergence of inner boundaries. You stop betraying yourself to maintain peace. You stop explaining yourself excessively. You stop chasing validation that never truly satisfies. This does not harden you. It clarifies you. Jung emphasized that individuation often makes a person appear simpler on the outside and deeper on the inside, less reactive, less performative, more grounded. Yet this is also where the fear of isolation can intensify. When you no longer operate purely from collective norms, you may feel misunderstood. Jung never romanticized this phase. He acknowledged its loneliness, but he also insisted that false belonging is more damaging than honest solitude. A person who abandons their inner truth for acceptance pays with fragmentation. A person who endures temporary solitude for authenticity gains inner unity. Another subtle test arises here: spiritual inflation. When people touch deeper layers of the psyche, they may feel special, chosen, or superior. Jung warned strongly against this. Inflation occurs when the ego identifies with archetypal energies instead of relating to them humbly. True individuation does not elevate you above others. It grounds you more deeply into your humanity. It increases compassion, not superiority. If insight makes you less patient, less kind, or less open, something has gone wrong. This phase demands balance. You're asked to honor your inner authority without disconnecting from reality, to stand firmly in your truth without needing to impose it. Jung saw psychological health not as perfection, but as dialogue, a living relationship between conscious intention and unconscious wisdom, between individuality and belonging, between freedom and responsibility. Consider this carefully. Are you seeking transformation to escape pain, or to meet life more honestly? Are you using insight to avoid vulnerability, or to deepen it? These questions matter because the psyche cannot be deceived. Whatever motive you bring inward will eventually be reflected outward. As individuation progresses, a quiet strength begins to form. You react less impulsively, you listen more deeply, you tolerate ambiguity without panic. You accept that life contains paradox, that light and shadow coexist, that meaning often emerges only after endurance. Jung believed that the capacity to hold opposites without collapsing into denial is a hallmark of psychological maturity. At this point, many people sense that they are standing at the edge of something final and irreversible, a threshold where there is no return to unconscious living. You can still turn away, distract yourself, numb the call. But if you have come this far, you already know the cost of doing so. The final phase is not about learning more. It is about surrendering control in a very specific way, without surrendering responsibility. The last realization, the one Jung considered both dangerous and liberating, is still ahead. It is the insight that reshapes identity itself and redefines what it means to live consciously. This is where the final test awaits. As you approach this final threshold, something becomes unmistakably clear. The struggle was never about becoming someone else. It was about relinquishing the illusion that you were ever separate from the deeper forces shaping you. Jung's most unsettling and liberating insight is this: the final test is not conquest, mastery, or perfection. It is surrender to wholeness. For most of life, the ego believes it must control everything to survive. It plans, defends, compares, and resists. This is not a flaw. It is a necessary stage of development. But Jung discovered that at a certain point, the ego becomes the obstacle, not because it is wrong, but because it refuses to step aside. The final test is the willingness to allow the self to lead, even when the path is uncertain, even when it contradicts the ego's preferences. This surrender is often misunderstood. It is not passivity. It is not resignation. It is an active cooperation with the deeper intelligence of the psyche. Jung observed that when people stop fighting their inner nature, life begins to move with a strange precision. Synchronicities appear, meaningful coincidences arise, not because reality has become magical, but because perception has become aligned. You finally see what was always there. At this stage, suffering changes its character. It no longer feels like meaningless punishment. It becomes information. Pain still exists, but it no longer defines you. You understand that discomfort is often the signal of growth rather than failure. Jung believed that neurosis itself is frequently the psyche's attempt to heal, a distorted call toward wholeness when consciousness refuses to listen. One of the most profound shifts here is the collapse of the need for external validation. You no longer require constant confirmation that you are on the right path. Approval becomes pleasant, but unnecessary. Criticism becomes informative, but not devastating. This inner stability is not arrogance, it is integration. You are no longer split against yourself. Here, compassion deepens naturally, not as a moral obligation, but as an organic response. When you have faced your own shadow honestly, you recognize it in others without condemnation. Jung emphasized that the more unconscious a person is, the more moralistic they become. Consciousness softens judgment. It replaces blame with understanding without excusing harm or abandoning boundaries. This is also where fear of death subtly transforms. Jung spent much of his later life contemplating mortality. He concluded that a life lived in dialogue with the unconscious prepares a person for death not with certainty, but with trust. When you have followed the inner process faithfully, death feels less like annihilation and more like completion. You sense that life has been meaningful, not because it was perfect, but because it was authentic. Now comes the final realization. the one that changes everything. The test was never imposed by the world. It was generated by your own psyche. Every challenge, every loss, every moment of disorientation was an invitation to consciousness. Passing the final test does not mean life becomes easy. It means life becomes yours. You stop asking why this happened to me and begin asking what is being asked of me now. You stop waiting for permission to live truthfully. You accept that uncertainty is not an enemy, but a condition of freedom. Jung believed that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of their parents. By individuating, you break this chain. You live what was previously unconscious, and in doing so you liberate not only yourself but those who come after you. If you are seeing this, if these words resonate deeply, it is not because you are chosen in a mystical sense. It is because you were willing to look inward when it would have been easier to look away. Awareness itself is the passage. Consciousness is the threshold. So reflect on this final question. If your life is an unfolding dialogue between the ego and the self, between who you think you are and who you are becoming, what choice are you being asked to make now? The secret Jung pointed toward was never hidden. It was simply uncomfortable. Become conscious, or be ruled by what you refuse to see. Passing the final test means choosing consciousness again and again, not once but for a lifetime. And that choice quietly made is what truly changes everything. Thanks for looking.